who else is all here? All right, let's just start from where we ended at. The facts and similar ones show that the overthrow of Reconstruction was in essence a revolution inspired by property and not a race war. The echo of the Northern Reform movement was felt in the South and encouraged the Northern capitalists and the more intelligent black people to unite in the Southern Reform movement. This was shown by the Chamberlain government of South Carolina, the Ames government in Mississippi, less clearly by the Kellogg government in Louisiana. The carpetbag reforms moved towards an alliance with the planters, with an understanding that called for lower taxes and the elimination of grift and corruption. Black voters began to support this program, but they're restrained by distrust. They feared that the planters still planned their disenfranchisement. If this fear could have been removed, and as far as it was removed, the power of the black vote in the South was certain to go gradually towards reform. It was this contingency that the poor whites in all grades feared. It meant to them a reestablishment of what subordination under black labor, which they had suffered during slavery. They therefore interposed by violence to increase the natural antagonism between Southerners and the planter class, and Northerners who represented the military dictatorship as well as capital, and also to increase the fear of black people that the planters might try to re-enslave them. The planters certainly were not disposed to make any permanent alliance with carpetbaggers like Chamberlain. After all, they were Northerners' recent enemies, and were responsible for the taxation that had gone before. The efforts at reform, therefore, is firstly widely applauded. One by one began to go down before the new philosophy, which represented the understanding between the planters and the poor whites. Hold on a second. Who's in here? I can try my best, but I don't think we're going to get any coins. This again was not an easy thing for the planters to swallow, but it was accompanied by difference in their social status, by eagerness on the part of the poor whites to check the demands of black people by any means, and by willingness to do the dirty work of the revolution that was coming. Its blood and crass cruelties, his bitter words, upheaval and turmoil. This was the birth and beginning of the Triple K. Before the war, there had been violent Southerner anti-black propaganda on racial lines, but that had been mainly for consumption in the North. Northerners traveled to the South, where always astonished at finding it accompanied by peculiar evidence of social equality and closer intimacies. In other words, there was no deep racial antagonism except in the case of poor whites, where it had a tremendous economic foundation. After the war, the race division, so long as the economic foundation was equitable, would have become less and less pronounced had it not been emphasized with the determination and the application of the Mississippi Plan, quote unquote. In this one of the anomalies of history, that political and economic form in the North and West after 1873 joined hands with monopoly and reaction in the South to oppress and enslave labor. Every effort was made by careful propaganda to induce a nation to believe that the Southern wing of the Democratic Party was fighting the same kind of corruption as the North, and that corruption was presented in the South solely by carpetbaggers and black people. This was only partly true in the South. For their labor too was fighting corruption and dishonesty, so far as land and capital, which were secretly abetting grift in order to escape taxation, would allow it to do so without disenfranchisement. But the South now began to use the diplomacy so badly lacked in its previous leadership since the war. Adroitly, it stopped attacking abolitionists and even carpetbaggers and gradually transferred all the blame for the post-war misgovernment to black people. The black vote and grift were dissoluble, linked in the public mind by insane propaganda. Race repulsion, race hate, and race pride were increased by every subtle method until black people and his friends were on the defense, and the black person himself almost conceived on his own guilt. Black haters and pseudoscientists raised their heads and voices in triumph. Lamar of Mississippi, fraudulently elected to Congress, incontagiously praising Sumner with his tongue and his cheek. The Louisiana solemnly promised to give black people full political and civil rights with equal education for black children, a deliberate lie which is absolutely proven by the revelation of the last 50 years. The South was impelled to brute force and deliberate deception in dealing with black people because it had been astonished and disappointed not by the black failure, but by his success, and promised a great success, promise of greater success. All this came at the time when the best conscience of the nation, the conscience which was here to the enthusiasm of abolition democracy, was turned against the only power which could support democracy in the South. The truth of the insistence of Stevens was manifest. Without land and without vocation, the black voter could not gain that economic independency which would protect his vote, unless therefore his political and civil rights were supported by the United States Army. He was doomed to practical enslavement, re-enslavement. But the United States Army became in the 70s the representative of the party of political corruption, while its political opponents represented land monopoly and capitalistic reaction in the South. When, therefore, the concise, is it conscious? No, concise, conscience. Yeah, conscience of the United States attacked corruption. It at the same time attacked the Republican Party and only power that could support democracy in the South. It was paradox too tragic to explain, and to deceived leading reformers like Karl Schwarz into consenting to throw the poor, arrogant, ignorant black workers whom he had helped to enfranchise, to the lions in the land monopoly and capitalist control, which proposed to devour them and did. In the South, reforms sought to follow the Northern model, and the carpetbag capitalists turned towards the purging of the civil service and the throttling of monopoly. In this, they gained the backing of many intelligent black people. But for one thing, they could have got the bulk of the black vote, and that one thing was the black person's distrust of the honesty of the planters. Objects. Did the planters want reform, or did he want re-enslavement of black labor? As a matter of fact, the planters got the beginnings of reform in the administration of the government in South Carolina, in Mississippi, and even Louisiana. He was aware that if that movement went far, it would prove that the black vote could be appealed to and made effective in good government as well as bad. This he did not want. As the South Carolina Democratic Convention said, April 1868, in the address to people of color, quote, "It is impossible that your present power could endure, whether you use it for good or ill," end quote. Back of this was the knowledge that honest labor government would be more fatal to land monopoly and industrial privilege than government by bribery and grift. The white South, therefore, quickly substituted violence and renewal of the war in order to get rid of the possibility of good government supported by black labor votes. There was not a single honest Southerner who did not know that any responsible political program, which included a fair chance for black people to get an honest wage, personal protection, land to work, and school for his children, would have received a staunch, loyal, and unyielding support of the overwhelming mass of black voters. But the program was ostensibly offered to black people, concealed determination to reduce him practically to slavery. He knew this, and in his endeavor to escape, floundered through bribery, corruption, and murder, seeking a path of peace, freedom, and the income of civilized man. The South was itself to blame. It showed no historic sign of favoring emancipation before the war, rather the contrary. It showed no disposition to yield to the offer of recompensated. I'm gonna make sure. What is this? There you go. It's gonna make sure. I probably have it right. I'm gonna make sure. Oops, wrong word. Recompense. Oh wait. Oop.
Recompense.
Yeah, recompense emancipation, which means to make amends to someone or for loss, harm, or effort. Recompense emancipation with Abraham Lincoln repeatedly made. It showed no desire to yield to emancipation with correspondingly curtailed political power as Congress suggested. It showed no disposition to reform democracy with the black vote. It relied on stubborn brute force. Meantime, the leaders of the Northern capital and finance were still afraid of the return of Southern political power after the lapse of the military dictatorship. This power was larger than before the war, and it was bound to grow. If it were to be used in conjunction with Northern liberals, it might still mean the reduction of the tariff and reduction of monopoly and an attack upon new financial methods and upon concentrated control in industry. There was now no sentiment like, quote, freedom, end quote, to which the Northern industrialist could appeal. It was therefore necessary for Northern capital to make terms with the dominant South. Thus, both the liberal and the conservative North found themselves willing to sacrifice the interests of labor in the South to the interests of capital. The temporary dictatorship, as presented by the Freedmen's Bureau, was particularly ended by 1870. This led to an increase of violence on the part of the Triple K to the subject of black labor, to strict domination by capital, and to break black political power. The outbreak brought a temporary return to military dictatorship, but the return was unpopular in the North and aroused bitter protests in the South. Yet the end that planters and poor whites envisaged, and as the fight went on, the end that large numbers of Northern capitalists were fighting for, was a movement in the face of modern progress. It did not go to the length of disenfranchising the whole labor class, black and white, because it dared not do this. Although this was its logical end, it did disenfranchise black labor with the aid of white Southern labor and with the silent acquiescence of white Northern labor. The white capitalists of the South saw a chance of getting rid of the necessity of treating with and yielding to the voting power and fully half and laboring class. It seized this opportunity, knowing that it thus was setting back the economic progress of the world. That the United States, instead of marching forward through the preliminary revolution by which the petty bourgeois and the laboring classes armed with the vote were fighting the power of capital, was disenfranchising a part of labor, and on the other hand, allowing great capital a chance for enormous expansion in the country. And this enormous expansion got its main chance through the 33 electoral votes, which the counting of the full black population of the South gave to that section. It was only necessary now that this political power of the South should be used in behalf of capital and not for the strengthening of labor and universal suffrage. This was a bargain in 1876. Reconstruction, therefore, in the South degenerated into a fight of rivals to control property and through that to control the labor vote. This rivalry between dictators led to grift and corruption as they bid against each other for the vote of black people. While meantime, black labor, in its arrogance, ignorance, and poverty, was agonizing for ways of escape. Northern capital compromised, and Southern capital accepted race hate and black disenfranchisement as a permanent program of exploitation. In a certain way, this straight strangle of laboring classes of 5 black millions was epitomized by the appearance of 16 of their representatives in the federal Congress from 1869 to 1876. These are the men, their states and their services. Hiram R. Revels, Senator, Mississippi, 1870 to 1871. Blanche K. Bruce, Senator, Mississippi, 1875-1881. Jefferson P. Long, Congress, Georgia, 1869 to 1871. Joseph H. Rennie, Congress, South Carolina, 1871-1879. Robert C. DeLarge, Congressman, South Carolina, 1871-1873. Robert Brown Elliott, Congress, South Carolina, 1871-1875. Benjamin S. Turner, Congress, Alabama, 1871-1873. Josiah T. Walls, Congress, Florida, 1873-1877. Alonzo J. Renzer, Congress, South Carolina, 1871-1873. James T. Ripper, Congress, Alabama, 1873-1875. Richard H. Kane, Congressman, South Carolina, 1873, 1875, 1877 to 1879. John R. Lynch, Congress, Mississippi, 1873, 1877, 1881, 1883. Charles E. Nash, Congressman, Louisiana, 1875 to 1877. John A. Hyman, Congress, North Carolina, 1875 to 1877. Jer Harrelson, Congress, Alabama, 1875 to 1877. Robert Smalls, Congressman, South Carolina, 1875 to 1879, 1881 to 1887. Several others like Menard of Florida, Pitchback of Louisiana, Lee, and others had excellent titles to their seats, but did not gain them. 12 of these men, who were the earliest to enter Congress, were ex-slaves or born of slave parents and brought up when black people were denied education. On the other hand, the other 4 had received a more or less complete college education in the North and abroad. 5 of the congressmen were lawyers, and 2, Elliott and Ripper, was unusual training and ability. Rhodes sneers at these men, quote, "They left no mark on the legislation of their time. None of them, in comparison to their white associates, attained the least distinction," end quote. But Blaine, who knew them and served with them, and with most of them, said, "The men of color who take seats on both Senate and House did not appear ignorant or helpless. They were, as a rule, studious, earnest, ambitious men whose public conduct would be honorable to any race," end quote. Most of the congressmen of color had had experience in state legislators and in public office. When these men entered Congress, questions of Reconstruction and of the economic and social conditions in the North and West were before it. These included the exploitation of public lands, the development of railroads, the question of money, and the relations of race in the South. Black congressmen, especially, had three objects to secure themselves civil rights, to aid education, and to settle the question of the political disabilities of their former masters. This last question became a paramount importance. Long of Georgia was in favor of removing disabilities if the Southerners proved loyal to the new legislation. Reville supported amnesty, but Rennie felt that it had led to force and murder. Eliot protested against amnesty, saying that the men seeking relief were responsible for the crimes perpetrated against loyal men in the South, and that these proposals put a premium of disloyalty and treason. All the black congressmen pled for civil rights for their race. It was here that Robert Brown Eliot made one of his greatest speeches in a dramatic situation, seldom equaled in Congress. Forney described the incident. Mr. Stevens, the vice president of the Confederacy, of which slavery was the cornerstone, spoke January 6, 1874, and Mr. Eliot, a person of color champion of the liberated race, followed him the next day. I cannot describe the house when the two men addressed it, especially when the African answered the Caucasian. We have a new history, a history that may indeed be repeated, but which stands alone in the novelty of all its surroundings, and in eloquence of all its lessons. Mr. Eliot, the last speaker, is a full-blooded black person, a native of Boston, Massachusetts, where he was born August 11th, 1842. Educated in England, he was not of age when the rebellion broke out, and in 1868, he was 26 years old, was a member of the South Carolina legislature, and elected to Congress by the Columbia District in 1872. He received 21,627 votes against 1,079 votes for Democratic candidate W.H. McCaw. Had any man predicted that these men of color, while attending school in 1853 at High Holborn Academy in Eton College, England, in 1855, would sit in Congress from the capital of the proud state of South Carolina in 1874, and would there confute the ablest apostles of the old slave power, he would have been pronounced a madam. Eliot defended against Stevens' civil rights for black people, said, "Sir, it is scarcely 12 years since that gentleman shocked the civilized world by announcing the birth of a government which rested on human slavery as its cornerstone. The progress of events has swept away the pseudo-government which rested on greed, pride, and tyranny, and the race whom he then ruthlessly spurned and trampled on are here to meet him in debate and to demand that the rights which are enjoyed by their former oppressors had vainly sought to overthrow a government which they could not prostitute to the base uses of slavery, shall be accorded to those who even in the darkest of the slavery kept their allegiance true to freedom and the Union. Sir, the gentleman from Georgia was learned much since 1861, but he is still a laggard." I have no idea what that means. Let's find out what that means. Watch it be a slur, and I use the damn slur. Ugh. Laggard. Person, group, or organization that falls behind others in progress. Laggards, like laggard, okay. Speed or development. So they're basically saying they're slow. That's bad. Let him put away entirely the false and fatal theories which have so greatly marred an otherwise inviolable record. Let him accept it in its fullness and beneficence. The great doctrine that American citizenship carries with it every civil and political right which manhood can confer. Let him lend his influence with all his masterly abilities to complete the proud structure of legislation which makes this nation worthy of a great declaration which herald its birth. And he will have done that which will most nearly redeem his reputation in the eyes of the world, and best vindicate the wisdom of that policy which has permitted him to regain his seat upon this floor. In the matter of the education, Rainey of South Carolina was one of the first Americans to demand national aid for education. Walls of Florida protested the national aid was not an invasion of states' rights and showed the discrimination of the distribution of state funds. The congressmen of color advocated local improvements, including distributions of public land, public buildings, and appropriations for rivers and harbors in Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, and South Carolina. Aside from these more personal questions, black congressmen discussed national economic matters. Wall of Florida and Lynch of Mississippi asked protective tariffs for local products, including cotton, lumber, and sugar. Walls voted for an appropriation for a centennial exposition of 1876 and urged the recognition of Cuba. Hyman championed relief of the Cherokee indigenous people. Bruce opposed the restriction of Chinese immigration, arraigning our selfish policies towards indigenous people, and especially advocated improving the navigation of the Mississippi and protecting life and property from its overflow. The words of these black men were perhaps the last clear, earnest expression of the democratic theory of American government in Congress. Congress DeLarge of South Carolina said in 1871, "When I heard the gentleman from New York, Mr. Cox, on Tuesday last hurled his shaft against the members of my race, charging that through their ignorance they had brought about these excesses, I thought he should have remembered that for the ignorance of that portion of the people, he and his party associates are responsible, not those peoples themselves. While there may have been extravagance and corruption resulting from the placing of improper men on official positions, and this is part of the cause of the existing state of things, these evils have been brought about by men identified with the race in which the gentleman from New York belongs, and not by our race." Congress Rainey of South Carolina said in the same debate, "Sir, I ask this House, I ask this country, I ask white men, I ask Democrats, I ask Republicans whether black people have presumed to take improper advantage of the majority they hold in that state by disregarding the interests of the minority. They have not. Our convention, which met in 1868 and in which black people were in a large majority, did not pass any proscriptive or disenfranchising acts, but adopted a liberal constitution securing alike equal rights to all citizens, white and black, male and female, all as far as possible. Mark you, we did not discriminate. Although we had a majority, our Constitution towers up in its majesty with provisions for equal protection for all classes of citizens." Hey, you got a friend. And they say he's just kidding. It was not when the race and the culture called out the South, called of the South in 1876. It was property and privilege, shrinking to its kind of privilege and property heard and recognized the voice of its own. The bargain of 1876 was essentially an understanding by which the federal government ceased to sustain the right to vote of half of the laboring population of the South and left capital as presented by the old planter class, the new northern capitalists, and the capitalists that began to rise out of the poor whites, with the control of labor greater than in any modern industrial state, civilized lands. Out of that, there was arisen in the South an exploitation of labor unparalleled to modern times, with a government in which all pretense at party alignment or regard for universal suffrage is given up. The methods of government have gone uncriticized, and elections are by secret understandings and manipulation. The dictatorship of capital in the South is complete. The military dictatorship was withdrawn, and the representatives of the northern capital gave up all efforts to lead the black vote. The new dictatorship became a manipulation of white labor vote, which followed the lines in similar control in the North, while it proceeded to deprive the black voter by violence and force of any vote at all. The rivalry of these two classes of labor and their competition neutralized the labor vote in the South. The black voter struggled and appealed, but it was in vain, and the United States, reinforced by the increase of political power of the South based on disenfranchisement of black voters, took its place to reinforce the capitalistic dictatorship of the United States, which became the most powerful in the world and which backed the new industrial imperialism and degraded people of color labor the world over. This meant a tremendous change in the whole intellectual and spiritual development of civilization in the South and in the United States because of the predominant political power of the South built on disenfranchised labor. The United States would turn into a reactionary force. It became the cornerstone of the new imperialism, which is subjecting the labor of Asian people, brown people, and black peoples of the dictation of capitalism organized on the world basis. And it was not only brought nearer the revolution by which the power of capitalism is to be challenged, but also it is transforming the fight to the sinister aspect of a fight of racial lines, embittered by awful memories. It is urged that black suffrage was bad because it failed, and at the same time that its failure was a proof of its badness. Black suffrage failed because it was overthrown by brute force. Even if it had been the best government on the earth, force exercised by the majority of richer, more intelligent, and more experienced men could have overthrown it. It was not overthrown so long as the military dictatorship of the North sustained it. But the South proved by appropriate propaganda that black government was the worst ever seen, that it is threatened civilization. They suited their propaganda to their audience. They had tried the accusation of laziness, but that was refuted by the restoration of agriculture to the pre-war level and beyond it. They tried the accusation of ignorance, but this was answered by the black schools. It happened that the accusations of incompetence impressed the North, not simply because of the moral revolt there against graft and dishonesty, but because the North had never been thoroughly converted to the idea of black equality. Then, therefore, the North, even granting that all the South said that of black people was not true, contemplated possibilities. It paused. Did the nation want black people with power sitting in the Senate and in the House of Representatives, accumulating wealth and entering the learned professions. Would this not eventually and inevitably lead to social equality and even to black sons and daughters in laws and biracial descendants? Was it possible to contemplate such eventualities? Under such circumstances, it was much easier to believe the accusations of the South and to listen to the proof by which biology and social science hasten to adduce of the inferiority of black people. The North seized upon the new Darwinism of the, quote, survival of the fittest to prove that what they had attempted in the South was an impossibility. And they did this in the face of the facts which were before them, the examples of black efficiency, of black brains, and phenomenal possibilities of advancement. Moreover, Americans saw throughout the world the shadow of the coming change and the philanthropic attitude which had dominated the earlier 19th century. What? Yeah. With regards to the backward race, international and commercial imperialism began to get a vision within the very echo of the philanthropy, which had abolished the slave trade, was beginning a new industrial slavery of black and brown and Asian workers in Africa and Asia. Arising from this, as a result of this economic foundation, came the change in the attitude towards these people of color. They used a different word that I'm not using. They were no longer brothers of black people, quote unquote. They were inferior. These inferiors were to be governed by their own good. They were to be raised out of the sloth and laziness by being compelled to work. The whole attitude of Europe was reflected in America, and it found in America support for its own attitude. So basically they're saying that America supported what people in Europe and stuff supported about black people in Africa. The Great Republic of the West was trying an impossible experiment. They were trying to make white men out of black men. It could not be done. It was a mistake to conceive it. The North and Europe were still under the sway of individual laissez-faire in industry and, quote, handoffs in government. Oh my gosh, I got a warning. Government. It was easy, therefore, for the North to persuade itself that whatever happened politically in the South was right. If the majority did not want black rule or black participation in the government, the majority was right. They would not allow themselves to stop and ask how that majority was made. They knew that an organized inner group was compelling the masses of white people to act as a unit, as pounding them by false social sanctions into false uniformity. They do that now. They still do that today. They still do that, guys. Everybody, we noticed this. If that part of the white South which had a vision of democracy and was willing to grant equality to black people of equal standings, had been sustained long enough by the standing federal police, democracy could have been established in the South. But brute force was allowed to use its unchecked power and the actions of the whites to destroy the possibility of democracy in the South, and thereby making the transition from democracy to plutocracy all the easier and more inevitable through the rift of opposition between votes for and against black people, between high and low tariffs, between free land and land monopoly. Plutocracy drove a silent coach and four. What the South did in 1876 was to make good its refusal, either to give up slavery or to yield the political power based on the counting of slaves. And so the South rode the wind until the whirlwind and accomplished what it sought. Did it pay? Did it settle either the black problems or any problem of wealth, labor, or human uplift. On the contrary, it made the government of the South a system of secret manipulation, with lies and cheating, with lying and cheating. It made its religious fundamental hypocrisy. And the South knows today that the essential black problem is just as it was, how far it dared let black people be a modern man. It was all so clear and right and logical. A nation could not exist half slave and half free. If it tried, either its mass of laborers would be force of competition sink into the depths of exploited arrogant poverty, or rising in ignorant poverty, or rising in bloody revolt, break the monopoly of land and materials, and endow the mass with more equal income and more political power to maintain their freedom. So in America came civil war over slavery of labor, and the end was not peace, but the endeavor really and honestly to remove the cause of strife, to give black freemen and white laborer land and education and power to conduct the state in the interests of labor and not of landed oligarch. Labor lurched forward after it had paid in blood for the chance, and labor, especially black labor, cried for light and land and leading. The world laughed. It laughed north, it laughed west, but in the South it roared with hysterical anger and vengeful laughter. And it said, quote, "Look at these inwards. They are black and poor and ignorant. How can they rule those of us who are white and have been rich and have at our command all wisdom and skills? Back to slavery with the unintelligent brutes," end quote. That's a horrible quote. Still, the brutes strove on and up with silent, fearful persistence. They restored the lost crops. They established schools. They gave votes to the poor whites. They established democracy, and they even saved the pittance of land and capital out of their still slave bond wage. The masters feared their former slaves' success far more than their anticipated failure. They lied about black people. They accused them of theft, crime, moral enormities, and laughable grotesqueries. They forestalled the dangers of the united Southern labor movement by appealing to the fear and hate of white labor, and offered them alliance and leisure. They encouraged them to ridicule black people and beat them, kill them, and burn their bodies. The planters even gave the poor whites their daughters in marriage and raised a new oligarchy on the tottering, depleted foundation of the old oligarchy. A mass of new rulers, more ignorant, intolerant, and ruthless because of their inferiority complex, and thus was built a solid South, impervious to reason, justice, or fact. With this arose the solid North, a North born of that North, which never meant to abolish black slavery, because its profits were built on it, but who had been gradually made by idealists and laborers and freed slaves to refuse more land to slavery, to refuse to catch and return slaves, and finally to fight for freedom since this perversed cotton, tobacco, sugar, and the Southern market. Then this new North fired up a vision of concentrated economic power and profit greater than the world had envisioned, tried to stop war and hasten back to industry. But the blind anger, bewildered South threatened to block the building of this new industrial oligarchy by the political power increased by the very abolition of slavery. Until the North had to yield to democracy and give black labor the power with which white Southerners, landholders, threatened Northern industry. In return, Northern capital bribed black and white labor in the South, white and black labor in the North. It thrust debt concessions and grift on the South, while in the North it divided labor into exploiting and exploited groups of skilled and highly paid craftsmen who might and did become capitalists, and a mass of ignorant, disenfranchised, imported foreign slaves. The West transformed its laboring peasant farmers into land speculators and investors, and united its interests through railways to the solid South in return for non-interference with big businesses. God wept. But that mattered little to an unbelieving age. That mattered most was that the world wept and still is weeping, and the blind with tears and the blood. For there began to raise in America in 1876 a new capitalism and a new enslavement of labor, home labor in cultured lands, appeased and misled by the ballot those who power the dictatorship of vast capital strictly curtailed, was bribed by high wage and political office to unite in the exploitation of white, Asian, black, and brown labor in lesser lands and, quote, breedings without the law, end quote, especially workers of the New World, folks who were American and for whom America was becoming ashamed of their destiny, sons of ditch diggers, inspired to be spawn of bastard kings and thieving aristocrats, rather than the rough-handed children of dirt and toil. The immense profit from this new exploitation and worldwide commerce enabled a guild of millionaires to engage in the greatest engineering and the wisest men of science, as well as high-paid wage to more intelligent labor, and at the same time to have left enough surplus to make more thorough the dictatorship of capital, over the state, and over the popular vote, not only in Europe and America, but in Asia and Africa. The world wept because within the exploited groups, the new world masters' greed and jealousy became so fierce that they fought for trade and markets in material and slaves all over the world until, at last, in 1914, the world flamed in war. The fantastic structures fell, leaving grotesque profits and poverty, plenty of starvation, empire, and democracy started at each other across world depression, and the rebuilding, whether it comes now or a century later, will and must go back to the basic principles of Reconstruction in the United States during 1876 and 1867 and 1876. Land, light, and leading for slaves, black, brown, and Asian, and white, under the dictatorship of the proletariat. Here's a poem. Prophet, what profit hath the sea of her deep-throated Thernoni? What profit hath the sun who stands staring on space with idle hands? And what would God himself acquire from all the eons, blood and fire? Fanny Stern Davis, from Crocodon, the Macmillan Company. And that's the end of that chapter. That was a good ending to that chapter, honestly. I think that was a really good ending to that chapter. That was a good ending to that chapter. Very good ending. Really trying to put it down to like the United States going into imperialism and stuff like that, and really subduing black votes and giving like white labor like a chance to become oligarchies over like black people and stuff like that, to really form a ruling class to dictate labor and stuff. So yeah, I like that. Founding the public school. All right, so I guess we're going to talk about public schools maybe. So we're on page 700. Ooh, founding the public schools. How the freedmen yearn to learn and know, and with the guiding hand of the Freedmen's Bureau and the Northern School Marum, helped establish the public schools in the South and taught his own teachers in New England college transplant to the Black South. So my whole take is that black people were purposely held in ignorancy on purpose. Like, I don't think black people, I know for sure that, like, if they actually gave them the opportunity, they'd probably be smarter. So yeah, like it's not because they're ignorant by choice, they're ignorant on purpose, because that's what that's what the planters wanted, and that's what the capitalists wanted. They don't want them to be smart. They want them to keep ignorant, and then they'll blame them from ignorancy at the same time. So it's just like a non-win-win situation at all. It was soon after the war that a white member of Johnson's restored Louisiana legislature passed on the school set up by the Freedmen's Bureau in New Orleans. The grounds were filled with children. He stopped and looked intently and then asked, quote, "Is this a school?" "Yes," was the reply. What for inwards?" Evidently, he threw up his hands. Well, he said, I have seen many and absurdities in my life, but this is the climax. Jesus Christ, end quote. If a poor, degraded, disadvantaged horde achieves sudden freedom and power, what could we ask of them in 10 years? To develop some, but surely not all, necessary social leadership, to seek the right to sort a leadership from other groups, to strive for increase of knowledge, so as to teach themselves wisdom and the rhythm of the united effort. This latter accomplishment crowns of the work of Reconstruction. The advance of black people in education, helped by the abolitionists, was phenomenal. But the greatest step was preparing his own teachers, the gift of New England to the black South. If black public schools system had been sustained, guided, and supported, the American black person today would equal Denmark in literacy. As it is, he surpasses Spain and Italy and the Balkans of South America. And this is due to the Black College, which, despite determined efforts to curtail the efficiency of the black public schools, in spite of sustaining the violent attacks upon higher education for black folk. Nevertheless, through white northern philanthropy, the black southerner contribution survived and furnished teachers and leaders for the black race at the time of its greatest crisis. The eagerness to learn among American black people, black Americans, I'm going to say, was exceptional in the case of a poor and recently emancipated folks. Usually with the protective psychology, such degraded masses regarded ignorance as natural and necessary, or even exalted their own traditional wisdom and discipline over, quote, book learning. Or they assumed that knowledge is for higher beings and not for the, quote, likeness of us. Black Americans never acted thus. The very feeling of inferiority which slavery forced upon them fathered an intense desire to rise out of their condition and means of education. Of the 488,070 free black people in the United States, and in 1860, 32,629 were attending schools, and only 91,736 were unable to read and write. In the slave states, there was 3,651 children of color attending schools supported by free black people. The mass of the slaves could have no education. The laws on this point were explicit and severe. There was teaching here and there by indulgent masters or by clandestine black schools. But in the main, the laws were followed. All the slave states had such laws. And after the Nat Turner insurrection in Virginia, these laws were strengthened and more carefully enforced. As late as May 1862, Edward Stanley, whom Lincoln appointed provisional governor of North Carolina, sought to conciliate the white people when he stopped a black school in New Bern. He said that he had been sent there to restore the old order of things, and that the laws of North Carolina forbade the teaching of slaves to read and write. He could not expect a success in his undertaking if he encouraged the violation of the law. At the time of emancipation, not all the Southern black people were illiterate. In South Carolina, the majority of the nearly 10,000 free black people could read and write, and perhaps 5% of the slaves. But illiteracy among the people of color population was well over 95% in 1863, which meant that less than 150,000 of the 4 million slaves emancipated could read and write. The first great mass movement for public education at the expense of the state in the South came from black people. Many leaders before the war had advocated general education, but few had been listened to. Schools for indigents and paupers were supported here and there, and more or less spasmodically. Some states had elaborate plans, but they were not carried out. Public education for all public expenses was in the South and a black idea. And prior to the abolition of slavery, there was no general public educational system, properly speaking, in the southern states, except perhaps in North Carolina. In some populous centers, there were free schools. In some localities, academias and colleges. But for the most part, no adequate provisions was made for the education even of the poor whites. Emerging from their bondage, black people in the very beginning manifest the utmost eagerness for instruction, and their hunger was met by a corresponding readiness on the part of the people of the North to make provisions for it. The original state constitution of North Carolina in 1775 provided for public education, but there is no appropriations for the schools, and the only direct result was the establishment of a state university. In 1825, a literary fund. I have to do a puzzle. Damn puzzles. Damn it. All right. Literary funds was established towards defraying the cost of public schools. A school system was sketched in 1839, but without the executive head, with small funds. In 1852, the superintendent of public instructions was appointed. His work for a long time was confined to propaganda, and he especially noted the lack of any demand for public schools and the feeling that such schools were simply for paupers. Nevertheless, the work of the first superintendent, C.H. Willey, was important as propaganda, but only as propaganda because at the time of the war, quote, only here and there in the state is there a schoolhouse for whites of very inferior descriptions and with long distance between, end quote. There was no state support for schools. The burden of public education, such as it was, rested on local authorities. In South Carolina, there was even less effort. In 1811, there was, quote, an act to establish free schools throughout the state, end quote. It provided for as many free schools in each election district as the district was entitled to representatives in the lower house. After 44 years of operations, 1811 to 1855, Governor A.J. Adams pronounced the system a failure, saying of the handling of funds, great inequalities prevail, and during 27 years return were made in only 5 years. The small district and parishes did not receive regular sums, and the amounts received did not have proportions to the number of schools or to the population. After 1855, the annual appropriations was $37,000 annually, nearly $1.5 million in all, of which only $109,740 was accounted for. In December 1855, Governor Adams pleaded for the appointment of a superintendent of education. Quote, let us make at least this effort, and if the poor of the land are hopelessly doomed to ignorance, poverty, and crime, you will at least feel cautious of having done your duty. End quote. He was, of course, referring only to the whites, and did not himself seem to believe much in educatability of the poor. In Virginia, Armstead reports that in 1851, less than one half of the poor white children were attending any schools, and those attending only 11 weeks in the year. This pitiable result was obtained with the cost of the state of $69,000. Thomas Jefferson in the 18th century had involved a school system for whites with industrial schools for black people. But there was this quote. But there was bitter and successful opposition, and as Jefferson himself said, such a permissive scheme was doomed to failure from the very moment its inception. In Georgia, the Constitution of 1777 had spoken of schools, but nothing was done. Some private academies were incorporated in 1783, and permission given the governor to grant 1,000 acres of free land for erection of free schools. But few, if any, grants were made. In 1815, $250,000 was appropriated, known as the Poor School Fund. Nothing further was done until the legislature of 1851, when something was added to this fund by paying tuition for children of parents too poor to pay anything. The whole fund for education was, as late as 1865, was only $23,355. Governor Brown urged a system of public schools before the war, but the legislature did nothing but make a small increase of the Poor School Fund. In 1858, a movement was started in Atlanta looking towards the establishment of a system of free schools in Georgia. A.N. Wilson went to Rhode Island to look into the public school system there, and on his return held several meetings, culminating in a meeting October 6, 1858, called by the mayor. The chairman appointed a committee, but some of the members of the committee took charge of the entire movement and blocked it. The original movers seeking fell through. The Constitution of 1865, under the provisional government, gave the legislature permission to appropriate money for, quote, promotion of learning and science, and, quote, for the education of the people, and providing, quote, the resumption of the regular exercises of the University of Georgia. In the first session of the legislature, after the war, a bill to establish public school was introduced, but postponed until late 1866 by a vote of 62 to 58 in the House and an equally close vote in the Senate. A bill to establish a system of public schools was squeezed through, but only on condition that nothing was to be done until 1868. This proposal lapsed because of the Reconstruction Act of 1867. Thus, although there had been much talk and some legislation on the subject, there had been, quote, no regularly organized system of common schools supported by public taxation in Georgia prior to the Civil War. Mississippi did lip service to the idea of public education in her earlier constitution, but little tangible was accomplished. The 16th section fund given to the states by federal government for education amounted to at least $15 million in Mississippi, was totally mismanaged and lost, while tens of thousands of white children grew up in ignorance. Florida tried about 1850 to obtain schools for whites for taxes on certain sales of slaves, with small results. Alabama and North Carolina had the best pre-war system due to the enthusiasm of certain teachers. But even here, there was no disposition among the planters to accept taxation for public education. Joel Riggs, controller. Ooh, I gotta look at this word. Let me look at this word real quick. Making sure I'm saying the right thing. COMPTRO. There it is.
Controller.
Oh, it's controller. Okay. A senior level executive or public official to oversee an organization account, official reports, internal audits. So controller of the state treasury in 1851 said, quote, perhaps of all trust funds, none has been so greatly mismanaged as the school fund of Alabama, end quote. The experience of the other southern states shows similar neglect and disposition to educate the poor whites. The fact of the matter was that in the pre-war South, there were two inseparable obstacles to a free public school system. The first was the attitude of the owners of property. They did not propose under any circumstances to be taxed for public education of the laboring class. They believed that laborers did not need education, and it made their exploitation more difficult, and that if any of them were really worth educating, they should somehow escape their conditions by their own efforts. The second obstacle was that the white laborers did not demand education and saw no need for it, save in exceptional cases. They accepted without murmur their subordination to the slaveholders and looked for escape from their conditions only to the possibility of becoming slaveholders themselves. Oh, okay. All right. Education they regarded as a luxury connected with wealth. It was only the other part of the laboring class, the black folk, who connected knowledge with power, who believed that education was the stepping stone to wealth and respect, and that wealth without education was bad. Perhaps the very fact that so many of them had seen the wealthy slaveholders at close range and knew the extent of ignorance and inefficiency among them led to the extraordinary mass demand on part of black laboring class for education. And it was this demand that was an effective force for the establishment of public schools in the South on the paramount basis for all people in all classes. If the planters opposed schools for poor whites, they all the more regarding black schools was absurd. The unalterable conviction of most white Southerners was that black people could not and would not learn, and thus their education involved an untrustable waste of private property for public disaster. Jesus Christ. D.R. Grattan, a native Virginian, testified before the Reconstruction Committee of 1866, quote, they cannot educate themselves. They are not disposed to educating themselves, end quote. In the face of this, listen to the words of Booker T. Washington. Few people who were not right in the midst of the scene can form any exact idea of the intense desire which the people of my race showed for education. It was a whole race trying to go to school. Few were too young and none were too old to make the attempt to learn as fast as any kind of teachers could secured. Not only were day schools filled, but night schools as well. The great ambition of the older people was to try to learn to read the Bible before they died. With this end in view, men and women who were 50 and 75 years old would be found in the night schools. Sunday schools were formed soon after freedom. But the principal book study in the Sunday schools was the selling book. Day school, night school, and Sunday schools were always crowded, and often many had to be turned away for want of room. So they were showing up. They're like, yeah. The first educational effort came during the war, when black refugees and soldiers were taught at various camps and places. The refuge at their own pressing request. This was followed by the effort of philanthropic societies. I can never say that word. Schools were started among black people of the peninsula in Virginia and at Point Royal, South Carolina, and as soon as they were captured. In Virginia, when federal authorities was established in the Southeast, the American Missionary Association asked to work among the freemen and was welcomed by Governor Butler. At the first day school was established on September 17th, 1861, in the town of Hampton, in a small town house near the seminary, a school formerly used by the whites. This school was taught by Mr. Mary Peck under the auspices of the American Missionary Association. Mr. Peck was a biracial person whose father was an Englishman. She was born a free woman and received a fair education at her home in Alexandria. She wanted to help her race, and she had gone among the slaves during slavery to teach them to read and write. She held her school in Hampton, however, only until the next spring, when she died of consumption at the early age of 39. Her school was not only the first one in Hampton, but the first of the kind in the South. Around the small schools, she began followed the other schools in the Hampton vicinity, all in which led to the Hampton Institution today. In January 1862, Solomon Peck had opened a school in Beaufort, South Carolina, and Bernard Lee at Hilton Head. In February 1862, quote, Edward L. Pierce, the General Thompson W. Sherman sent out a call to, quote, a highly favored philanthropic people. So it's PHILATHROPIC. I can't say it. My tongue won't let me say it. Of the North, to send volunteers to teach both old and young in rudiments of civilization and Christianity. Freemen's aid societies were formed at Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. 41 men and 12 women teachers went to Port Royal in March. 8 schools were in operation by May, and within a year, 30 with 3,000 students. Officers held schools for black soldiers and many black people who had bought abandoned lands, opened schools at their own expense. Port Royal School was in 1855 had 6 teachers. Schools for their children had been supported by the free black people of Charleston since 1744, openly at first, clandestinely after the law forbade them. When Johnson was inaugurated, the event was celebrated in Charleston, South Carolina, by opening the public school to all children without distinction of color. 25 of the 42 teachers were people of color. The Tribune said March 10th, 1865. So the thing is done. The loyal white people, the Irish and German population, have shown that they are quite willing to let their children attend the same schools as the royal black people. Although it is true that no attempt to unite them in the same room or classes would have been tolerated at the time. But in the playground, white and black boys joined in the same sport as they do in the public streets. And there can be no doubt that now that this great step has been made, all the prejudice against equal educational advantages will be speedily vanished. And indeed, it is the various hypocrisy of the city where very old families have aided in obliterating all the complexional distinctions by mingling their blood with that of their slaves. Oh my God. In the rooms where children of color assembled, there were many children with clear blue eyes, pure white skin, oh my gosh, long silky hair without kinks, oh my gosh. And yet there were classes with the black population by the former rulers of the city. God. So just the white people are good. God damn it. A month later, came the significant celebration. I walked to the square of William Lloyd Garrison, think of the great pioneer abolitionist of Boston in the streets of Charleston. As Mr. Garrison entered the square, he was introduced to about 2,000 children by Mr. James Redpath, superintendent of public instruction. When the children were told who Mr. Garrison was, they surrounded him, threw up their hats and caps, caught hold of him, fell down over each other, and sent a shout after shout of such welcome and greetings as I may safely say was never before witnessed on the soils of South Carolina. Even if, oh my God, you're still racist in that whole fucking statement still. Many private schools were established by Jonathan C. Gibbs, after the superintendent of schools in Florida, after another by F.L. Cardozo, who became state treasurer of South Carolina, and others in various parts of the state. In the second year of freedom, 23 schools in different localities were built by black people, aided by Freemen's Bureau and philanthropy. The Freemen contribution to support the school teachers was $12,252 and $500 to schoolhouses. In Beaufort, black people opened a building for a free high school bought and supported entirely by them as early as 1867. In the West, General Grant appointed Colonel John Eaton, afterwards United States Commissioner of Education, to the superintendent of freemen in 1862. He sought to establish and regulate schools and succeeded in organizing a large system. Louisiana had schools for free black people, supported by them before the war. After the Army established a large system in March 22nd, 1864, General Banks, on his own responsibility, had made provisions for the establishment of schools for freemen by an order issued which did not meet the approval of many in Louisiana. He appointed a board of education of 3 persons and granted a large power. Oh my gosh, I got something in my eye. I hate that when that happens. Get on my eye. There we go. All right, where was I at? Hold on. I'm finding it. He was appointed to was established. Okay, I was going to start right here. On March 22nd, 1864, General Banks, on his own responsibility, had made provisions for the establishment of schools for freemen by the order issued, which did not meet the approval of many in Louisiana. He appointed a board of education of 3 people and granted it large power. It was to establish 1 or more common schools in every school district defined by the provost marshal, to acquire by purchase or otherwise land for school sites, to erect schoolhouses, and to employ teachers as far as practicably oh my gosh, I gotta look at this word, everybody. I'm not saying it correctly. Practicable. Yeah, I was wrong. Practicable among the loyal citizens of Louisiana, to furnish books, to provide every adult freeman with a library costing $2.50. This amount to be deducted from the wages of the said freemen, and finally, to levy for these purposes of school tax on real and personal property in every school district. Then the collection of a general tax for black schools was superintended in Louisiana by military order, and people of color were greatly aroused and sent in petitions. One of these petitions, 30 feet in length, represented 10,000 black people who signed mostly with marks. They offered to pay a special tax if the schools would keep would be kept going. When the Confederates returned to domination, the public schools, which had attained a degree of efficiency, were before reached in the South, were greatly curtailed. 110 of the teachers, many of them native born, were dismissed at once, and their places filled with intolerant Confederates. The most noted of the clandestine school of free children of color was opened in Savannah in 1818 and 1819 by a person of color, Frenchman, named Julien Formontaine from San Domingo. Up to 1829, the school was taught openly. After December 22nd, 1829, it was made a penal offense to teach a black person or free person of color to read or write. Fontaine's school, however, flourished clandestinely for many years, and in a sense laid the foundation of a new state system of public instruction, which gave equal school privileges to all children, regardless of race or color. The public school system of Georgia started in the conference in Savannah, December 1864. The Stanton Secretary of War and General Sherman met 5 or 6 leading black people and decided upon schools. It was a notable gathering. The Committee of Color, People of Color Committee consisted of 8 to 10 leading ministers of color of Savannah. Secretary Stanton was astonished at the wisdom and tact of those untutored black people, and observed that the men's replies to his questions were, quote, so shrewd, so wise, and so comprehensive. They were the picked men of the race in Georgia, and a great native ability, and would have attracted attention to any assembly. It was decided to have the schools open at once for all people of color who should apply, at a time as was set for examination of teachers and of numbers of men of color and women applied. The citizens of color of Savannah were greatly encouraged and assisted in their efforts by the Reverend James Lynch of the AME Church, an educated man of color who afterward became Secretary of the State for Mississippi. Early in January 1865, the Reverend J.W. Alvard, Secretary of the American Tract Society, Boston, who had done business in Savannah for a number of years before, gave his assistance. He and Mr. Lynch examined the teachers. 10 people of color were found competent, and was very difficult to find buildings in which to locate the school. The most available space was the, quote, Old Byron Slave Mart, end quote, which had recently served as a pen for which relatives of many of these black people had been sold. The bar which marked the slave stall were knocked down to make more space for seating. To this and other places flocked the free people of every age and shade, eager for that book learning, which really seemed to them the key to their advance. By December 1865, people of color of Savannah had opened a number of schools with 500 pupils, and they were contributing a fund of $1,000 for the support of teachers. In January 1866, black people of Georgia organized the Georgia Educational Association, whose object was to induce the freemen to establish support schools in their counties and neighborhoods. In 1867, 191 schools and 45 night schools were reported as existing. Of these, 96 were reported either wholly or in part supported by the freemen, who also owned 57 of the school buildings. Persistent propaganda presents the South after the war as being largely in favor of black education. This was a flat contradiction. A planned historical evidence, Dunn says, quote, Black people were disliked and feared almost in exact proportion to their manifestations and intelligence and capacity. And there were many reasons in the utterance of Southerners to support his generalization. Quote, education of black people, they thought would be labor lost, resulting in injury instead of benefit to the working class. The teacher of the Freedmen's Bureau, or a private philanthropies, interfered with labor and encouraged directly and indirectly insolence to employers. Schools felt the South ruins a inward. Ugh, these guys suck. An attempt at education provokes the most intense and bitter hostilities and evincing a desire to render themselves equal to the whites. Their churches and schoolhouses in many places were destroyed by mobs, of course. Oh, I think... All right, we'll do this one, okay. Inward teachers was one of the most of Forbes epithets that the Southern vocabulary furnished. Even in the North, this prejudice existed among some of the avowed friends of the free people. And it is a singular fact that one of the earlier freedmen's aid societies was rent asunder by the unwillingness of the part of its members to cooperate in many movements looking towards the education of black people. They were willing to provide him with food and clothing in order to prevent suffering and death. The teachers who went down from the North were soon disillusioned. If they were at all influenced by any other, the most serious missionary spirit, obstructionism is a mid-term for the disesteemed with which they were regarded as, quote, inward teachers. And we'll stop there. Wow. Thank you, black people, for setting up the public system, the public school system. Sounds like they were like bringing it up and making it happen. And these white people were like, no, we can't have you better than us. We must have you below us. No. It's wild. It is wild. All right, so we stopped on 710. Read a lot. Yeah, 710. Who's this? Oh.
Hello.
Hello. What's up? Do you want to add something?
Yeah, I wanted to agree with you on thank you, Black people, for our education. And wow, that was fucking hard to read and definitely very educational.
Yep. So we can think. So, like, again, black people to save white people again. Oh, Jesus Christ. And then they just took over and like, no, white black people, you're out. Let's get the pork, And then they were worried about their labor, like, oh no, we're gonna lose our labor, we're gonna lose our slaves because they're gonna make them smart. We can't have smart workers. No, it's impossible. If we have smart workers, they'll rebel. Well, no shit. That's why, like, a lot of these politicians nowadays, like Trump says it all. He says it. He says the quiet thing out loud. I like the uneducated. He says it out loud, what every politician likes, what every rich person wants. They want uneducated people, unconscious people of themselves, so that way they can continue their exploitation and an alienation of people. So, yeah.
I agree.
Yeah, so. But anyways, is there anything else you would like to say?
Nope, that was it.
All right. I like the ending of the last chapter when it went into the labor thing and it talked about those things. That was awesome. And like how like they're like starting imperialism and stuff, like manifest destiny and shit. It was fucking, yeah. But anyways, if anybody else has anything, who else is here? I don't think there's many people here. No, just the regular people. All right, well, come back tomorrow. We'll read some more. I'm gonna reflect on what I read and I enjoyed it this time. We're almost finished. I think I'm either going to do psychology of oppression or alienation. I don't know. I think I might do psychology of oppression. I'm kind of worried about it. But anyways, I'm going to go ahead and close it out, everybody. I hope everybody has a good evening. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, right? Saturday, right?
Happy Saturday.
All right. Enjoy your rest of your weekend, everybody.